On the 14th of March, 1873, in the basement of the Royal Institution on Albemarle Street in London, a junior technician named Frederick Parslow was cataloging a collection of electrical instruments. They had been donated following the death of their owner. The morning was cold and gray. A thin London fog pressed against the high basement windows, muffling the sounds of carriages overhead. Parslow worked by oil lamp, his breath visible in the chill. His handwriting was steady as he recorded each item in a leather-bound ledger. He cataloged copper coils, glass Leyden jars, a mahogany-cased galvanometer. Then he reached a wooden crate at the back of the room, unmarked, its slats bound with iron strapping that had begun to rust. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a coil of wire, unlike anything he could identify. It was thick, nearly the gauge of a ship's cable, and wound in a spiral pattern that did not correspond to any instrument he had seen. The accompanying note, written in a hand he could not attribute, read simply, "Surplus from Brunel trial, 1858. Not for correspondence, not for correspondence." Parslow wrote it down and moved on. But that phrase, those 3 words, sat at the edge of a question that would take another century and a half to fully form. What else exactly were the wires for? The history of the telegraph is taught in schools as a clean narrative. Samuel Morse. Dots and dashes, messages sent across continents at the speed of light. The images of thin copper wires strung between wooden poles, carrying language encoded in pulses, collapsing distance, stitching together a fractured world. It is a story of communication, of information, but embedded within the engineering records, the patent filings, the field reports of the men who actually built and operated the telegraph networks of the mid-19th century, is a second story, quieter, more technical, and almost entirely forgotten. The telegraph lines were not merely carrying messages, they were carrying power. And the men who built them knew it, debated it, and in some cases deliberately obscured it. By the spring of 1837, the telegraph was still largely theoretical. 2 competing designs were in development simultaneously, one in England, one in America. In London, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone were racing to patent their needle telegraph, a system that deflected magnetized needles by running electrical current through a set of wires. In New Haven, Connecticut, Morse was perfecting the single-wire system that would bear his name. Both systems relied on the same fundamental fact. That electrical current, when passed through a copper wire of sufficient length, would still arrive at its destination with enough energy to move a mechanism, a needle, a stylus, an electromagnet. The current was not merely a signal, it was a physical force acting across distance. This is where the standard history stops explaining. The force moved the needle, and the needle spelled the message. But the engineers, writing to each other in letters that have survived in fragments across several archives, were noticing something else. The current was doing more than what was asked of it. In a letter dated 22nd of November, 1839, held in the archives of the Institution of Electrical Engineers, a letter whose existence is mentioned in a footnote in a 1921 technical history, but whose contents were never reprinted, Wheatstone wrote to Cooke with a specific concern. Their demonstration line was running from Paddington to West Drayton. He noted that workmen stationed at intermediate points along the line were complaining of warmth in the iron relay housings. Not malfunction, warmth. Sustained, steady warmth that persisted even when no message was being transmitted. Wheatstone's explanation, written in the careful language of a man who did not wish to overstate, was that the residual current, what he called the continuing tendency of the circuit, was dissipating as heat along the line. This was a known phenomenon. Joule's law, published the following year, would give it mathematical form. But Wheatstone's letter does not stop at explanation. In a second paragraph, partially obscured by a water stain that makes several words illegible, he writes that the warmth is not without potential utility, that Cooke should consider what they are, in effect, delivering beyond the signal itself. The letter then ends. The reply, if one was written, has not been found. Across the Atlantic, a parallel observation was forming in different terms. On the 3rd of September, 1844, a year after Morse's famous Baltimore to Washington demonstration line opened to public use, a maintenance operator named James Cassidy filed an incident report with the Magnetic Telegraph Company. The report is preserved in the National Archives in Washington in a collection of administrative papers that were never indexed for public access until 2004. Cassidy's report described an incident at a relay station in Relay, Maryland, appropriately named as the station's function was to boost the signal for the longer lines southward. Cassidy noted that a trough of water placed near the relay housing to humidify the room during dry months was, by mid-afternoon, consistently warm. He described the temperature as comfortable, as a bath might be kept. He was not alarmed. He was curious. His supervisor's handwritten annotation at the bottom of the report reads, "Acknowledged. Relay housing generates expected heat. No action required. No action required." But Cassidy's observation, small and administrative as it seemed, was recording something that the engineers at the company's headquarters were actively, if quietly, analyzing. The telegraph network was not just transmitting signals, it was transmitting energy. Time equals 400 milliseconds, and as the network expanded, and as lines began running not for dozens of miles, but for hundreds, then thousands, the scale of that energy transmission grew with it. By the autumn of 1851, a submarine cable had been successfully laid across the English Channel, connecting Dover to Calais. The engineering feat dominated the newspapers. Queen Victoria exchanged telegrams with Napoleon III. The world celebrated. But in the technical offices of the Electric Telegraph Company in London, a quieter set of calculations was underway. The channel cable carried current not in pulses, but in a sustained flow, interrupted by the coding of messages. Between those pulses, the current did not stop entirely. It diminished, but it continued. A memo, unsigned, dated the 14th of January, 1852, found in a mislabeled folder in the British Telecom Archives in Holborn, contains a handwritten table. Along one column are distances. Along another are values that appear to represent electrical power, not signal strength. Power. The table is accompanied by a single sentence. The idle current accounts for more than the active. The idle current. The current between the messages. This was the thing that kept appearing in the margins of the official record. And the margins are where the real story lived. By the 1860s, the telegraph network had become the central nervous system of the industrial world. In the United States, alone, over 100,000 miles of wire stretched across the continent. In Britain, Europe, and through submarine cables to India and the Caribbean, the network formed a web of unprecedented scale. Millions of messages moved through it each year. Fortunes were made and lost based on its speed. Armies coordinated through it. Markets moved to its rhythm. The telegraph was, by any measure, the most significant communications technology the world had ever seen. But alongside the communications infrastructure, something else was being built. In the technical literature of the 1860s and 1870s, articles began to appear discussing the telegraph line not as a signal conduit, but as a power conduit. These articles were careful. They framed their arguments in the language of waste reduction and engineering efficiency, but their underlying argument was radical. The same wire that carried a message could, with modifications, carry sufficient electrical power to do mechanical work at a distance. On the 7th of May, 1864, in Birmingham, a mechanical engineer named Thomas Melling filed a patent application. It described a system for operating small machines in workshops using electrical current supplied through telegraph wires during periods of low message traffic. The patent was denied. The examiner's note, preserved in the Patent Office records at Kew, stated that the application conflicted with the exclusive telegraphy licenses granted to the Electric Telegraph Company. Not that the technology was implausible, not that the engineering was flawed, that it conflicted with an existing commercial license. Melling's patent application and the examiner's note sat in the archive for over a century before being referenced in a 1998 paper by a historian of industrial technology named Dr. Allison Hart, published in a journal with a circulation of fewer than 2,000 readers. Conflicts with existing license. 4 words. A door closed. The transatlantic cable, when it finally succeeded in 1866, changed the scale of everything. Now the network was not continental, but global. Electrical current was flowing beneath 3,000 miles of ocean, sustained and continuous, pulsing through gutta percha insulated copper wire at the bottom of the Atlantic. The engineers who designed and maintained the cable system, men like Fleming Jenkin, whose notebooks are held at the University of Edinburgh, were acutely aware that the cable was not merely a communication channel. In his private correspondence, Jenkins used a phrase that appears nowhere in his published work. He called the cable the first practical demonstration of power at distance, distinct from what he called the special case of the signal. Power at distance, the signal as a special case. This inversion, this suggestion that the message was the secondary function and the power transmission the primary, appears only in private correspondence, in the margins of technical notebooks, in the footnotes of papers that were themselves never widely circulated. Time equals 400 milliseconds / the official record described the telegraph as a communications device, full stop. But in the spring of 1872, on the 3rd of March, in a cluttered office above a hardware shop in New York City, a young inventor named Nikola Tesla, then still living in Serbia, still years from emigrating, was nonetheless connected to this history. Connected by a chain of influence that ran through the engineers he would study under in Graz and Budapest. His professors had studied under men who had studied the telegraph networks. The understanding that electrical current could be separated from its informational content, that the power and the signal were not the same thing, was already embedded in the technical culture he was absorbing. When Tesla would later speak of wireless transmission of power, when he would insist that energy could be moved through the earth itself, he was not inventing a new idea. He was extending an old one. The telegraph lines had already demonstrated it. They had been doing it, quietly, for 30 years. By the 1880s, as electric lighting began to spread through the cities of Europe and America, the telegraph companies faced a choice they rarely acknowledged publicly. Their infrastructure, the poles, the wires, the relay stations, the rights-of-way, overlapped almost perfectly with what would be needed for an electrical power distribution network. In some cities, the overlap was not coincidental. In London, the first demonstration electrical lighting systems ran along streets where telegraph wires already hung. The workmen were often the same. The companies, in some cases, were not. On the 19th of November, 1882, a memo was circulated within the General Post Office in London, which by that point had nationalized the British telegraph system. The memo discussed the feasibility of using the existing telegraph network for what it called the secondary carriage of electrical energy. The phrase is bureaucratic and careful, but the meaning is clear: using telegraph wires to distribute electrical power. The memo was marked not for external circulation. It was filed in a category listed only as Confidential Engineering Studies, 1880s. It was not declassified, if that is the right word for a post office document, until 1961. By 1961, the idea it contained had already been implemented, repeatedly, under different names and by different entities, as if the memo itself had never been written. Below the stamp, in pencil, a different hand had added a single question mark. By the turn of the century, the distinction between the telegraph and the electrical power grid was hardening into institutional reality. Separate companies, separate engineers, separate regulatory frameworks, separate histories. The story of telegraphy became the story of communication. The story of electrical power became the story of Edison and Westinghouse and the current wars. The two narratives diverged, and in diverging so, they erased the period, the crucial 40-year period from roughly 1845 to 1885, when they had been a single question, approached by single engineers, moving through single wires. In the archive of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., there exists a collection of equipment from the Western Union Telegraph Company, donated in several batches between 1967 and 1974. Most of the collection is well documented: keys, sounders, batteries, cable samples. But within the collection, described only as miscellaneous relay components, origin uncertain, is a set of devices that do not correspond to any relay design used in standard telegraph operations of the 19th century. They are larger than message relay equipment. Their coil windings are heavier gauge. Their mechanical action is slower and more forceful. A conservator who examined them in 1991 noted that the devices most closely resembled components from an early electric motor system, but that they had clearly been adapted or repurposed from something else. Adapted, repurposed, the language of concealment hiding inside the language of maintenance. On the 6th of October, 1903, in a laboratory in Colorado Springs that he was preparing to close and vacate, Tesla gave what would be one of his final coherent interviews on the subject of power transmission. The journalist recorded Tesla as saying, "The wire was always the wrong lesson. What they learned from the wire is that current moves. What they should have learned is that power moves, and the message is incidental." The interview was published in an engineering journal with limited distribution. It was not reprinted in the mainstream press. The suit. Journalists' notes, if they survive, have not been located. The power moves. The message is incidental. By the 1920s, with radio beginning to replace telegraphy for long-distance communication, the great telegraph networks began their slow dismantling. Poles came down, relay stations closed. The infrastructure that had connected the industrialized world for 70 years was gradually absorbed, some of it into telephone networks, some of it into early electrical distribution systems, some of it simply scrapped. But the knowledge embedded in the network did not disappear entirely. It migrated. It moved into the education of a generation of electrical engineers who had begun their careers on the telegraph lines and finished them building the power grid. In the winter of 1931, a retired Western Union engineer named Harold Vance gave a series of informal lectures to engineering students at the University of Michigan. The lectures were not recorded, but a student named George Kellerman kept detailed notes, which he preserved in a personal notebook that eventually passed to his son, and then, upon the son's death in 2003, was donated to the university library in a box of miscellaneous papers. Kellerman's notes, discovered during a cataloging project in 2011, record Vance as having described the early telegraph lines in terms that no standard history employed. Vance said that the operators of the largest relay stations had been aware since the 1860s that they were handling, his word, more than messages, that the energy moving through the long lines was sufficient, at certain nodes, to power small machinery, that some relay stations had, informally and without official authorization, done exactly that, tapped the line current to run workshop tools, to power small lights, to heat water for the operator's use during long winter shifts. Kellerman's notes break off at that point. The next page of the notebook is missing, torn out cleanly. The remaining edge smoothed, suggesting removal rather than accident. The clean, deliberate line where a page used to be. In September of 2019, a commuter on the London Underground, the Jubilee line between Waterloo and London Bridge, stood near a ventilation grill set into the tunnel wall. The train had stopped briefly between stations, the lights dimming as power redistributed. Through the grill, she could feel warmth. Not the warmth of the tunnel. That was accumulated heat, decades of breaking energy trapped in the earth. This was warmer, and it had a faint vibration to it. She pressed her fingers against the metal grating and felt the current in it. She mentioned it to a Transport for London engineer at the next station. He told her it was normal, a standard artifact of the signaling system. The warmth was the current in the control circuits, dissipating as heat, as current always does along a long wire, as it always has. Since 1839, time equals 500 milliseconds greater than, since the relay housings on the Paddington line grew warm, and Wheatstone wrote his letter and reached for a word for what he was observing, and found only the word utility. And the word sat in the archive for 180 years, waiting. The signaling system in the London Underground carries both data and power through the same infrastructure. The train control circuits, the communication systems, the track monitoring networks, they run on wires. And through those wires flows both the signal and the energy to sustain the signal. The engineers who designed the system did not think of themselves as inheriting a telegraph tradition. The history had been sorted into separate disciplines before they began their studies. Communication was one field, power engineering was another. But the wire doesn't know the difference. The wire carries what moves through it, and what moves through it has always been more than the message. In the autumn of 2022, a research team at Imperial College London published a study examining the thermal profiles of telecommunications infrastructure in dense urban environments. The study found that modern fiber optic repeater stations, the nodes in the global internet infrastructure where signals are amplified over long distances, generate heat outputs consistent with power-level electrical dissipation, not signal-level dissipation. The study used language that was careful and technical. It noted the measurements. It suggested further study. It did not draw the historical parallel. Because the historical parallel lay in a different discipline, under a different set of keywords, in archives that had not been cross-referenced. The repeater stations, the relay houses, Parslow's coil of wire, thick as a ship's cable, Melling's denied patent, the torn page in Kellerman's notebook, the warmth Cassidy felt rising from a trough of water by a relay housing in Maryland in the humid September of 1844. The chain runs unbroken, but it runs through absences, through the missing reply to Wheatstone's letter, through the pages marked not for external circulation, through the patent denied for commercial reasons rather than engineering ones, through the footnote that referenced a document without reprinting it. The Telegraph did not simply transmit messages. The engineers knew this. Some of them tried to formalize it, to patent it, to name it. They were stopped, not by the limits of the technology, but by the limits of the legal and commercial frameworks built around a simpler story. Communication was a business. Power was a different business. The wire that could do both was a problem for an industry organized around doing one. So, the wire was described as doing one, and the rest was filed, marked confidential, or simply not discussed, because the people who understood it best had moved on to other problems. What remains is the pattern, the same pattern repeating across a century and a half of infrastructure, the signal and the power running through the same conductor, the official description acknowledging only the first, the physical reality insisting on both. Today, the power lines that cross the countryside carry not only electrical energy, but fiber optic cables wound into their construction, transmitting data alongside the current. The two functions bundled into the same right-of-way, the same physical structure, the same path through the landscape. The engineers who designed this hybrid infrastructure call it convergence. They mean it as a modern solution to a modern problem. They do not typically trace the word back to the men who first noticed that a wire does not distinguish between what it carries. Parslow cataloged the coil and moved on. His ledger entry survives. The coil itself does not. Or if it does, it is in a crate somewhere, marked miscellaneous. Its label describing one thing, while its gauge suggests another. The warmth has not stopped rising from the relay housings. The current has not stopped being more than the signal. The question Wheatstone almost asked in his 1839 letter, the question he reached toward and then set down, is still waiting in the margin of the historical record, where all the most important questions tend to live, not for correspondence. The phrase loops back, as these things always do, to the beginning. Whatever was in that coil of wire, whatever Brunel's engineers were testing in 1858, on a line they never fully explained, it was not meant to carry words. It was meant to carry something else, something the vocabulary of the time had no clean name for. Something the vocabulary of our time has several names for, none of them connected, by the history books, to the wooden poles and copper wires and relay house that first demonstrated it, quietly, in the margins of the age of messages. The fog moves in off the Thames. The archive closes for the evening. Somewhere beneath the city, in tunnels older than the telephone, current moves through wire. It does not know what it is carrying. It carries what it is given, and it gives off heat, and the heat rises. And no one has filed an incident report in quite some time.